everyone. I'm live on all the channels. Hello, so nice to be here. Kinsey Berkwin here. I hope everyone had a wonderful 4th of July. For those of you that don't know, the 4th is my birthday, so it was extra special. We were in Breckenridge over the weekend, which turned out to be like the most amazing place to celebrate the 4th. So we'd have to make that a tradition. But I hope everyone had a wonderful 4th of July, and it feels good to be back at it this Monday. It's always kind of hard after a long weekend, right? So, nonetheless, I have got an exciting talk for you today that I think blends two areas of interest for people. One is gut health and one is mental health. But specifically, I'm instead of the two very broad categories, obviously, I'm going to talk specifically about how small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, and intestinal methanogen overgrowth, or IMO. Those are two very similar but technically different GI conditions. So I'll elaborate on what those are. But I'm going to talk about how those two conditions affect mental health, specifically anxiety, depression. You can also weave in ADHD as well. And then also mental performance. So, like mental clarity, focus, cognition, things like that. So this is very relevant, I think, for a lot of people. SIBO, it's estimated anywhere from 35 to some studies predict 80% of IBS cases are directly caused by SIBO or IMO. So if you struggle with IBS symptoms, which of course I'm going to go through a list of different symptoms, and if you struggle with anxiety, depression, ADHD, brain fog, etc., still be really relevant for you, even if you don't have a formal diagnosis at all across the board, digestive or mental health. If you resonate with these symptoms, it will definitely be meaningful for you to listen. So before I jump into it, to introduce myself for those of you that don't know me, my name is Kinsey Berkwin. I'm an integrative nutritionist in my online nutrition and wellness practice called Progressive Health and Wellness, where I work with ambitious men and women who are struggling with their mental or physical health by taking a root-caused body-mind approach to optimize their overall health and wellness. So today's agenda, first I'm going to talk about what SIBO and IMO are. Then I'll get into the 4 different ways, and this isn't an exhaustive list, obviously, but these are 4 ways that I see very readily in my practice of how these gut conditions affect our brain and mental health. And then I'll wrap up the conversation with solutions. I'll talk about testing and I'll talk about some supplements and dietary recommendations. First, this won't be an exhaustive talk on SIBO and IMO. I have given that before. So if you want that, please go to my Facebook group, Holistic Solutions for Mental Health and Wellness, and I search SIBO or IMO, and those live talks will pop up. The posts I've given, I've posted, the blog articles I've written, all of that information will pop up there. This talk, I am going to talk about the symptoms. I'll talk about the mechanisms, like how those things form and how they affect our mental health. But I'm primarily going to focus on that piece, how they affect the brain and our mental health. Okay, so, and as usual, if you're here listening, watching me live, if you are listening to the replay, please drop a comment and let me know that you're here. Hello, someone on YouTube commented, "Hi, glad to be here." Okay, so first, what SIBO and IMO are. So I mentioned small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO, intestinal methanogen overgrowth is IMO. So both of these are conditions essentially of overgrowth, as the name implies, of different species of bacteria in the small and or large intestine. So to start off with SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, that is limited to the small intestines. And it is classified or characterized by different species of bacteria overgrowing in the small intestines. And when that happens, they will ferment different starches or fibers that we eat in the diet that come from healthy foods, commonly referred to as FODMAPs or fermentable starches. They'll ferment those starches from the diet, the food that we're eating, and produce either hydrogen sulfide, or methane gas. Now, the classic presentation of SIBO is diarrhea and constipation mixed, or it's still diarrhea or constipation, but it's a severe form. It can be extremely painful, urgent, very painful gas, bloating, cramping, nausea, and that's caused by hydrogen sulfide. So, like I said, one of the three gases being produced in SIBO. When it comes to IMO, intestinal methanogen overgrowth, you notice that does not delineate only the small intestines. So in intestinal methanogen overgrowth, this can happen in the small or large intestines, and it's characterized by an overgrowth of archaea or methane-producing bacteria. But typically, especially when it's typically it's going to be archaea. So in the this can happen in the large intestine. It can happen in the small intestine. The other thing that can happen is kind of an overlap almost, where the SIBO bacteria, the bacteria associated with SIBO that produce hydrogen, they may be producing hydrogen. The archaea in the small intestines eat that hydrogen and produce methane. So intestinal methanogen overgrowth is a little bit more broad in that sense, that it can happen in the small or large intestine and is characterized by an overgrowth of archaea. Sorry, one. Okay, there we go. Intestinal methanogen overgrowth leads to constipation. So specifically constipation, period, because methane slows intestinal motility, sometimes by up to 70%. In some cases, it can even create almost a reverse motility, where instead of that coordinated wave-like motion propelling digestive contents from one end down to the other, from the mouth down to the rectum, it almost causes it to go backwards or at least stagnate. And that's part of where the constipation comes from. But also bloating and acid reflux as these gases and digestive juices get trapped. So how do these conditions contribute to mental health? There's a number of ways. First, I want to highlight I've talked a lot about this before, about the cytokine model of, I'm going to say mental health, because you can research the cytokine model of depression, but that's also being connected or expanded to anxiety and ADD and these other conditions as well, even bipolar and schizophrenia, et cetera. So looking at through the lens of that model, where mental health is a product of brain inflammation, or mental health challenges, I should say, is a product of brain inflammation, we can now make a strong connection between gut health, the environment, the brain, and mental health challenges. So to list off 4 of the biggest ways that I see regularly in my practice, one is nutrient deficiencies. So with SIBO and IMO, I had a professor describe it really well one time when they said that overgrowths in the small intestines, the bacteria, or large intestines for that matter too, but digestion and absorption largely occurs in the small intestines. I should say absorption largely occurs in the small intestines. So when there's an overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestines, these bacteria will eat our nutrients and produce waste products. So we know that bacteria in the small intestines can create deficiencies of iron, of magnesium, B vitamins, zinc, calcium, some of the major players. It can also lower hydrochloric acid levels in the stomach, and those hydrochloric acid is needed for the proper absorption of those nutrients. So deficiencies in those nutrients can directly be tied or connected to anxiety, depression, and focus or cognition problems. So that's one example. In fact, this is something I look for in blood work when I'm first working with a client. So in our initial consultation, we can run blood work. I measure a number of different nutrients, B vitamins, iron, magnesium, calcium, zinc, copper included. And I'm looking at these to see, especially iron, if there's low iron in somebody that's eating an iron containing diet, like they're not vegan, in other words, that's a red flag. There's a number of different things that can cause that, obviously, but that's a red flag, especially if the person has the symptoms of SIBO and IMO, which I'll go over in just a second. Actually, you know what? Let me talk about that first. So, nutrient deficiencies is a big one. And that is you can supplement, yes, but it's going to be very difficult to truly fix or bridge that gap while the overgrowth is still occurring. And it's not only just the bacteria that's eating those nutrients, it's the GI inflammation that that bacteria causes that also hinders our ability by inflaming the small intestines, hinders our ability to absorb those nutrients. So it's kind of a double whammy. So, nutrient deficiencies is a big, especially talking about like iron, magnesium, B vitamins. This is huge when it comes to mental health. And if the person's diet already isn't really providing those nutrients, it's going to be hit even harder and can really contribute to severe nutrient deficiencies. Before I move on to three of the other ways that SIBO and IMO affect mental health, let's talk about some of the symptoms to make it relevant. So, some of the most common symptoms: acid reflux, diarrhea, constipation, or mixed, an alternation of both. Bloating is huge. I would say, like, distended, feeling 4 months pregnant bloating is one of the most common symptoms as those gases get trapped in the intestines. There can be GI pain or cramping. Those are some of the most common GI symptoms. But outside of that, we can then expand it greatly. So that's where we can look at like histamine intolerance. We know SIBO and IBO can contribute to histamine intolerance, mental health, anxiety, depression. Anxiety in particular and brain fog are two of the biggest things I see. I would see especially some of the symptoms I most commonly see would be IBS type symptoms, bloating, acid reflux, anxiety, and brain fog. Sometimes we see depression, but it's less common than anxiety in my experience. Reacting to many different foods. So, eating what seems to be a healthy diet, but randomly having these food reactions that don't always appear to be consistent. Intolerance to kind of the classic gas producing foods. So, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, onions, garlic, beans, those all happen to be high in what are called FODMAPs, which are those fermentable fibers I was talking about before. So, I know in a lot of ways, society has deemed that to be somewhat normal for those foods to cause gas, but you know, for some people it could be an easy fix. It depends on how those foods are prepared. But if it causes a lot of discomfort, then I would look more at a microbiome imbalance. Weight gain, thyroid issues, insomnia. These are some of the other skin conditions like eczema. These are some of the other manifestations that are possible with SIBO and IMO. I would say those, especially the extra intestinal manifestations, it really depends on the person. The most common are GI, right? The most common are the reflux, the bloating, the IBS type symptoms. Like I said, anxiety is extremely common, brain fog, very common, but I would keep it to GI, especially if you do any research on those. That's largely what you're going to find. And then weight gain. Some people experience weight loss. I would say weight gain is more common, at least from what I see. Okay, so continuing. The other ways that SIBO and IMO can affect mental health. And then I'll start to get into solutions, talking about testing and some recommendations. So, next is lipopolysaccharides. So, this is where we talk about inflammation as a whole. So, these microbes produce and contain different endotoxins. So they will produce the hydrogen sulfide, methane gas, sometimes ammonia. They'll produce TMAO. They'll produce a number of different toxins as just part of their normal metabolic processes that negatively affect our body and brain. They also contain what are called lipopolysaccharides. So, lipopolysaccharides are components of the outer membrane of gram negative bacteria, and they're highly inflammatory. To give you an idea, researchers that are studying the inflammatory response will often use lipopolysaccharides to induce inflammation to therefore study it. So we know how pro-inflammatory lipopolysaccharides are. They degrade the integrity of the gut lining. They can cross through the gut lining into the rest of the body and trigger inflammation systemically, including damaging the blood-brain barrier and stimulating inflammation in the brain, which gets us back to that cytokine model of mental health. So that's a specific way of explaining one of the mechanisms, at least, by which SIBO and IMO cause GI inflammation, systemic inflammation, and brain inflammation. Number 3 is how they affect the gallbladder. So the inflammation caused by the bacterial and archaea overgrowths can inflame the gallbladder, and the added toxic load that it puts on the body can thicken bile, create sludgy bile. Not to mention, at least in SIBO, I haven't read this with IMO, but at least in SIBO, and I would imagine with IMO, just given the constipation, they can eat bile salt. They will deconjugate bile salts. And so they make our bile acids essentially less effective. Not only does that affect our ability to digest and absorb fats and fat-soluble nutrients, but bile acids are normally protective. Bile acids, they affect the pH of the small intestines to prevent overgrowths like this happening in the first place. But these bacteria are able to deconjugate bile acids, which, like I said, therefore affects our digestion and absorption. And sludgy, thick bile can then go on to further inflame the gallbladder. It affects our digestion, more greatly. It affects the liver. If there's thickened bile, that can harden into stones, that can back up and inflame the bile ducts in the liver itself. So it's kind of a cascading effect. I would say gallbladder issues are that is something I often see in people that have been diagnosed with SIBO and IMO. That can manifest as a pain or a pressure in the upper right quadrant of the abdomen, kind of where the solar plexus is, but over towards the right. Lighter colored stools, so either very, 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 very light brown, a grayish color stool, yellow or orange, loose or hard constipated stool, both can happen. Nausea, overall itching, reddened palms. Those are some of the other symptoms of gallbladder issues. Okay, and lastly is hormonal imbalance. So, because a lot of the ways that I've explained already, so through nutrient deficiencies, inflammation in the digestive tract, in the body, the burden on the detox pathways, which can affect the gallbladder and the liver, all of those things can have an effect on hormones. So we've talked a lot about how sensitive the thyroid is to inflammation, to nutrient levels. The gallbladder, if there's inadequate bile dumping, that will significantly affect our estrogen levels, our progesterone, testosterone. The inflammation can affect all of these hormones and cortisol, the stress hormone. And then nutrient deficiencies. Our endocrine system is very reliant on proper nutrient balance. We need iron and zinc and B vitamins for producing our hormones and um, adequately clearing them. Otherwise, we can get inadequate production of hormones. We can get a backup of hormones. Specifically, I'm thinking of estrogen. This constant source of inflammation can trigger cortisol and lead to imbalances or dysregulation in cortisol. So, if you're listening to this and you have the GI symptoms, you have the anxiety or the brain fog, and you've been diagnosed with either hypothyroidism or you have that wired but tired feeling when it comes to cortisol dysregulation, or you have PMS symptoms, or you're transitioning into menopause and it's becoming a very difficult journey. If you can't lose weight, if you have like pre-diabetes, I mean, all of these things can very much be connected back to SIBO and IMO. But they can also, of course, affect our mental health too. We know hypothyroidism can contribute to anxiety, depression, brain fog. We know estrogen, progesterone imbalances can do the same thing, and same thing for high cortisol. But again, those are all symptoms of a deeper condition, and that is SIBO and IMO. Okay, how is this making sense so far? Is this resonating with people? Are there any questions that have come up? Please let me know or tag me in the comments. So what do we do about it? First things first, if you don't know for sure if SIBO or IMO is what you have, testing is recommended. So we can base that, I would say for everyone. I was going to say we can base it on your symptoms, but I would say for everyone, if I suspect it, I always run a stool test. So I'm saying a stool test. Stool test would not be able to confirm SIBO, but it would give us an idea if IMO is happening because the GI map stool test measures Methanobacter bacteria. So, archaea. So that the stool test would give us an idea for archaea, especially if constipation is a problem or bloating. It would also allow us to really get a thorough look at the health of the digestive tract. So we'd be able to see inflammation levels, digestion and absorption. Are there other infections or other overgrowths? Is H. pylori present? We'd be able to get a full view of what the health of the digestive tract would look like. And in a lot of cases, I'm able to see patterns in the stool test that would make me suspect SIBO. I wouldn't be able to confirm it because the stool test is looking at large intestines. SIBO happens in the small intestines. But that combined with symptoms and history is often enough to make me give the inclination that SIBO might be part of the picture and then recommend the associated testing. Elsie Self, yes, we can definitely chat. I'm so glad you're here. For testing for SIBO, that is a breath test. So it can be done through endoscopy and an aspirate test where they take a sample of the fluids. It's obviously much more invasive. I only share that because some people are already planning on having an endoscopy. And if that's the case, they can do that. But the gold standard is going to be a breath test. The breath test does have limitations, yes, but it's the most sensitive that we have available right now. And in my case, I see a lot of positives come through. So it's more where we kind of question the validity is if somebody is having urgent liquid diarrhea. Sometimes the transit time is so fast that it prevents the accumulation of the gas enough to be able to come out in the breath for a positive test. But nonetheless, there is one test called Trio Smart. It's direct to consumer. You can go online and order this yourself. That tests all 3 different gases. Depending on the person's symptoms, I don't always test this. If I don't suspect hydrogen sulfide, then I don't always run the Trio Smart. But I would say most of the time I do, because why not, right? Let's be as thorough as we can. So the Trio Smart will look at hydrogen, hydrogen sulfide, and methane. Like I said, it's a breath test. So what that typically entails is there will be dietary recommendations that have to be followed the day before. Certain supplements have to be stopped. Certain medications have to be stopped. Like you can't have taken antibiotics at least 2 weeks before. Then the morning of, you drink a solution, lactulose. Sometimes they use glucose, but in this case, it's lactulose. Drink the solution, blow in a bag over the course of 3 hours, and then you send that off to the lab. And we get the results. But that is what would be more definitive for SIBO and IMO if there's an overgrowth of methane. Now, once you have that information, the recommendations from there largely depend on what gas it is. So for dietary recommendations, for example, and I'll say the rest of your health picture. So for dietary recommendations, if we know if SIBO is confirmed in its hydrogen gas, I recommend low FODMAP. Low FODMAP can be very effective for hydrogen dominant SIBO. So diarrhea, again, some of the other symptoms, but hydrogen dominant SIBO, low FODMAP can be really effective. I'm not going to go into the details of low FODMAP, but basically it's an elimination diet designed to be followed for 2 to 6 weeks, and it removes the highly fermentable foods. And FODMAPs is an acronym for fermentable oligodisaccharides and polyols. Those are different categories. And then after that 2 to 6 week period, you introduce foods from each category to figure out what your trigger is. Basically, that's it in a nutshell. But low FODMAP is really great for hydrogen dominant SIBO. For hydrogen sulfide, we would do a low sulfur diet. For methane, we do more of an anti-inflammatory diet. So there's not a specific diet that has been shown to be effective for methane. I put people, pretty much everyone, on kind of a paleo Mediterranean style diet. So that's what I mean by anti-inflammatory. But there's not a specific, like low FODMAP hasn't been shown to be effective for methane. There's no need to do low sulfur because there's not an excess of sulfur. So there's not a diet specific to methane, in other words. So we do anti-inflammatory. From there, we would do, as far as supplements go, we would start to incorporate antimicrobials. And even that depends on the overgrowth and the person's presentation. I will say it's common, not everyone, but some people that have SIBO or IMO will have histamine intolerance. So in those cases, a low histamine diet and histamine support, like supplementing with DAO or quercetin, vitamin C, et cetera, can be really helpful. From there, we move into antimicrobial protocol. But this is where we get a lot more nuanced. So we want to first support the nutrient density. We want to support their drainage pathways. Then we would move into an antimicrobial protocol. There's a range of different herbs that have been shown to be effective. Oregano is a big one, berberine, neem. There's different herbal blends like biocidin and candibactin AR and BR. So there's a number of different herbal approaches. There are medications as well, pharmaceuticals that can be used. So I won't get into the specifics of how to really fix the SIBO through supplements. I go into that a little bit more detail in that more exhaustive talk I gave. So you can go search my Facebook group for that. But when it comes to supporting the mental health piece, I mean, ultimately getting rid of the overgrowth will be necessary, right? But there are some things that you can do ahead of time to help support your mind and brain. One is magnesium glycinate. So magnesium glycinate is magnesium bound to glycine, and both the mineral and the amino acid greatly help calm the brain and nervous system. So if you're struggling with insomnia or anxiety or ADHD or ADD, that can be really, really helpful. And it's pretty readily absorbed. People can notice the difference within the first day or two of taking it. So magnesium glycinate can be really helpful. B vitamins, if you're not already supplementing with B vitamins can be really helpful too. They're water soluble, so while they're readily available in the diet, we don't store them. And so if there's a deficiency, and especially if your diet doesn't already provide B vitamins adequately, that deficiency could be really easy to develop. But B vitamins they're energizing. They're needed to create energy. They're needed in the detox pathway in the liver. They're needed to manufacture all of our neurochemicals in the brain. So B vitamins could be a really great addition as well. Binders can be helpful because of the endotoxins that the bacteria produce. So things like charcoal or bentonite clay, fulvic humic acids, like these can be really helpful at binding to the toxins in the gut and carrying them out through the digestive tract so they're not further absorbed into the rest of the body. And then omega-3s. I love cod liver oil because it also has vitamin A and vitamin D, but omega-3s can help calm the inflammation and have a high affinity for the brain. Omega-3s help maintain the myelin sheath that surrounds every neuron, which helps in their neuronal transmission. It also helps modulate the inflammatory response. So omega-3s are another great addition to add, and can also have been shown to also directly support mood and mental health. There are some more kind of mood focused supports. Be cautious with these. There are contraindications if you're taking any kind of psychiatric medications like MAO inhibitors or SSRIs, for example. You'll want to check with your doctor. But 5-HTP and glycine can be really helpful for boosting serotonin and boosting GABA, respectively, which helps with this positive, light, optimistic outlook, more relaxed, more relaxed. And theanine, L-theanine can also be really, really helpful for having that calm, relaxed, optimistic outlook. All right. I think that covers it. Are there any questions? Again, if you're watching the replay, if you're watching me live, are there any questions that come up? Comment, tag me in the comments and let me know. Otherwise, thank you for being here. And if you're listening to this and you've either been diagnosed with SIBO or IMO, you suspect you have it based on the symptoms, you've looked into it on your own. If you're struggling with anxiety and digestive symptoms, and you want to talk to someone about it and learn about what you can do, please schedule a free 15-minute call with me. It's a discovery call. The intention is to allow us to get to know each other better, talk more about some of the challenges that you're having, the goals you have, and what you're looking for. And if it feels like a good fit, then we'll talk about what next steps look like. And if not, that's okay too. All right, everyone. Thanks for being here. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.